Hey guys, tonight we begin with ancient Rome, a civilization that ruled an empire, engineered miracles and still found the time to deeply personally judge your face. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In ancient Rome, beauty was not a compliment. It was a court ruling. Romans did not believe appearances were accidental. To them, your face was a public document, your body a character reference, and your posture a sworn testimony. If you looked orderly, balanced and composed, congratulations, Rome assumed you were a decent human being. If you didn't, Rome immediately suspected poor self-control, weak morals, or a dangerous amount of free time spent thinking instead of obeying tradition. Beauty was evidence of discipline. A symmetrical face suggested inner harmony. Calm features implied emotional restraint. A well-kept body meant you knew when to stop eating, drinking, and enjoying yourself. A very Roman skill. Looking good wasn't about charm, it was about proving you could restrain your worst impulses like a civilized adult and not a roaming barbarian. Roman philosophy loved balance. Too much of anything was a red flag. Too much pleasure, corrupt. Too much grooming, suspicious. Too much muscle, probably a laborer. Too little muscle, possibly soft. You were expected to land perfectly in the narrow, invisible lane labeled respectable, and God help you if you drifted slightly to the left. Judgment was instant. Romans did not wait to hear your opinion on politics, poetry, or olives. They assessed you visually first. Your face told them whether you were reliable, disciplined, or someone who might ruin dinner with emotional outbursts. Beauty wasn't admired, it was decoded, and the pressure was constant. Senators, matrons, soldiers, and citizens all participated in this silent beauty tribunal. If you wore too much makeup, people assumed vanity. Too little, negligence. If you aged poorly, moral decay. If you aged too well, deception. There was no winning, only surviving with minimal gossip. This belief made beauty exhausting, because failing to meet Roman beauty standards wasn't neutral. It suggested personal failure. It implied you lacked discipline, moderation, or basic respect for Roman values. And Rome did not appreciate people who reflected badly on Rome. So before we talk about pale skin, hair dye, or eyebrow opinions, remember this. Roman beauty standards were not about attraction, they were about control. In ancient Rome, your face wasn't asking to be admired. It was being cross-examined. If Roman beauty had a single non-negotiable rule, it was this: do not look like you work outside. In ancient Rome, skin tone wasn't about health or genetics. It was about class. Pale skin signaled leisure, wealth, and a life spent indoors doing respectable things, like supervising servants or judging other people. Tanned skin, meanwhile, screamed labor, and not the glamorous kind, the kind involving dirt, sun, and effort. All three were deeply unfashionable. To be visibly sun-touched was to advertise that you worked the land, carried loads, or existed too close to agriculture. And while Rome depended entirely on agriculture to survive, it preferred not to see the people doing it. Pale skin was proof that your body had been spared the indignity of usefulness. Elite Roman women took this standard very seriously. They avoided the sun with parasols, heavy clothing, and the kind of commitment usually reserved for religious devotion. Staying pale required effort. You didn't just avoid sunlight, you planned your life around not encountering it accidentally. One careless stroll at noon and suddenly you were ruddy, which in Roman terms was only one step away from socially alarming. Men, interestingly, were allowed slightly more colour, but only slightly. A faint tan suggested military service or controlled outdoor activity. Too much tan, however, implied farming, or worse, manual labour. And nothing undermined Roman dignity faster than looking competent at physical work. To enhance paleness, women applied whitening powders made from chalk and other substances that history now describes as extremely unwise. These powders created an artificial brightness that signalled status from across the room. You didn't need to ask who belonged to the elite. You could see it reflected in the light bouncing unnaturally off their faces. And here's the quietly funny part. Rome worshipped conquest, expansion, and empire, all things achieved outdoors, while simultaneously treating outdoor exposure as socially embarrassing. The empire was built under the sun, but beauty lived firmly in the shade. Skin, then, was a billboard. It announced where you spent your days, how you lived your life, and whether you deserved respect. It wasn't about attractiveness, it was about distance. Distance from labour, distance from necessity, distance from everyone who kept Rome running. In Rome, paleness didn't mean you were delicate. It meant you were important enough not to sweat. Once Roman women accepted that pale skin equaled virtue, the next logical step was simple: manufacture it. Nature, after all, was unreliable. The sun existed, skin tones varied. This was unacceptable. So Rome did what Rome always did. It applied technology, confidence, and extremely questionable materials. Roman makeup was not subtle, it was functional. Its job was not to enhance beauty, but to correct reality. The most popular cosmetic was face powder, designed to make the skin look as pale, smooth, and light-reflective as possible. These powders were made from chalk, crushed minerals, and in a move that history judges harshly, white lead. Yes, lead, the kind that slowly poisons you, but very fashionably. White lead created a flawless porcelain-like complexion that screamed status from across the room. It also caused skin damage, hair loss, neurological problems, and a slow descent into physical misery. But Rome didn't connect those dots right away, and even if it had, beauty was considered a worthwhile sacrifice. You weren't just looking good, you were signaling moral superiority. Rouge was applied to cheeks to give the illusion of youth and vitality, because nothing says healthy like artificially painted circulation. Eye makeup was dark and dramatic, made from soot or antimony, outlining the eyes to make them appear larger and calmer. Large eyes suggested emotional restraint, thoughtfulness, and most importantly, that you were not constantly overwhelmed by life like some kind of barbarian. Makeup application was a daily ritual, and not a pleasant one. Powders cracked, paint flaked, sweat betrayed you. Maintaining the look required constant attention, frequent reapplication, and an impressive tolerance for discomfort. Servants assisted with this process, which again reinforced the message. If you had time and help for this, you were doing well in society. Roman men officially claimed to dislike heavy makeup on women. Unofficially, they expected the results. This created a familiar situation where women were judged both for wearing too much makeup and for not meeting the standard it produced. Rome perfected the art of impossible expectations centuries before social media. And let's be honest, makeup wasn't about beauty. It was about control, about presenting the correct face to the world, regardless of cost, even if that cost was your long-term health. In ancient Rome, cosmetics didn't ask, "Do you feel confident?" They asked, "How much are you willing to endure to look respectable?" In ancient Rome, eyes were not just eyes, they were character witnesses. A Roman could look at your eyes and decide whether you were calm, disciplined, intelligent, trustworthy, or someone who would absolutely ruin a dinner party by speaking too loudly. Ideal eyes were large, clear, and composed. Not wild, not overly expressive, certainly not darting around like you were hiding something. Rome preferred eyes that looked like they had their emotions under strict supervision. Large eyes were especially admired because they suggested openness and balance. Small or narrow eyes, on the other hand, were sometimes associated with cunning, dishonesty, or excessive cleverness, which sounds flattering until you remember that Rome deeply distrusted cleverness, unless it belonged to the Senate. Expressiveness was not a compliment. Emotional restraint was. To achieve this ideal, eye makeup was essential. Dark pigments made from soot or antimony were applied around the eyes to create contrast, making them appear larger and more defined. The goal was not seduction, it was composure. You weren't trying to look mysterious, you were trying to look like a person who had never panicked in public. The irony, of course, was that this makeup often caused eye irritation. Many Roman women walked around with watery eyes, mild infections, or permanent damage, all while maintaining the appearance of serene self-control. Nothing says Roman virtue like suffering quietly while pretending everything is fine. Eyebrows played a role here too. Carefully shaped brows framed the eyes and helped maintain balance. Too thin, and you looked frivolous. Too thick, and you looked unrefined. The correct brow communicated moderation, Rome's favourite word when it came to judging others. And here's where Rome gets particularly Roman. Eyes were expected to reflect your moral state even when you weren't trying. A downcast gaze could signal modesty. A steady gaze suggested confidence. Staring too long was aggressive. Looking away too quickly was suspicious. There was a correct way to look at people, and everyone was quietly keeping score. Men were judged by their eyes as well. A Roman man was expected to have a firm, controlled gaze, alert but not emotional. Eyes that appeared soft, overly expressive, or dreamy could undermine masculine authority. If your eyes looked like you were thinking about poetry instead of duty, people noticed and judged. In ancient Rome, eyes were never neutral. They were constantly interpreted, analyzed, and quietly criticized. You weren't just seen, you were read. At some point in Roman history, someone looked at two perfectly separate eyebrows and thought, "This feels excessive." Thus began Rome's complicated relationship with eyebrows. In ancient Rome, connected eyebrows were considered attractive. A single continuous brow was believed to signal intelligence, seriousness, and deep thought. In other words, if your eyebrows met in the middle, Rome assumed you had opinions worth hearing. If they didn't, Rome quietly wondered if you were thinking hard enough. This preference wasn't universal across all periods, but it was strong enough to cause genuine anxiety. Women whose eyebrows naturally joined were lucky. Everyone else had a problem to solve, and as with most Roman problems, the solution involved makeup, patience, and pretending this was all very normal. Women without a natural unibrow often painted one on. They used dark pigments to carefully connect the brows, creating a neat intentional line across the forehead. Too thin and it looked fake, too thick and you risked looking unrefined. The ideal Roman eyebrow connection was subtle, noticeable, but not dramatic. Like most Roman beauty standards, it existed in a narrow zone where failure was easy and success was exhausting. Why did Rome like this? Because symmetry and continuity suggested order. Two separate brows implied fragmentation. One continuous brow implied unity, focus, and seriousness. Rome loved seriousness. Rome distrusted frivolity, and nothing said frivolous quite like excessive eyebrow separation. Men were not immune to eyebrow judgment either. A Roman man with overly groomed brows risked appearing vain. A man with wildly unruly brows, however, looked uncivilized. The perfect male brow required minimal effort while somehow looking perfect, an impossible standard that Rome expected anyway. Eyebrows also played a role in facial expression. Raised brows suggested surprise or emotional excess. Furrowed brows implied thoughtfulness, but too much furrowing made you look angry or unstable. The correct eyebrow position was calm, composed, and quietly judgmental. The Roman emotional baseline. The truly cruel part, eyebrows were one of the few features you couldn't fully control. You could powder your skin, you could line your eyes, but eyebrows grew back on their own schedule, completely uninterested in Roman ideals. So people adjusted constantly, plucked here, painted there, checked reflections obsessively, because in Rome, even your eyebrows were expected to participate in the performance of virtue. In ancient Rome, your thoughts weren't the only thing being evaluated. Your eyebrows were also under review. In ancient Rome, hair was not just hair, it was a construction project. A Roman hairstyle told everyone who you were, how much money you had, how much free time you enjoyed, and whether several other human beings were employed solely to touch your head. Hair was status made visible, and Rome took it very seriously. For women, elaborate hairstyles were the ultimate signal of wealth and leisure. The more complex the hairstyle, the more obvious it was that you did not work. Some styles involved braids stacked on braids, curls arranged into towers, and sections pinned so precisely they resembled engineering diagrams. These hairstyles could take hours to create and required skilled slaves known as hairdressers, whose entire job was making sure one strand out of place didn't ruin your social standing. If your hair looked effortless, it meant effort had been expended by someone else. Simple hairstyles were associated with modesty, youth, or necessity. Complex ones suggested maturity, power, and an ability to sit completely still while someone tugged aggressively at your scalp. Beauty in Rome often involved pain, and hair was no exception. Women endured tight braids, heavy pins, and uncomfortable wigs in the name of looking respectable. Complaining was discouraged. If your head hurt, you were doing it correctly. Hair color mattered too. Blonde hair was fashionable, partly because it was rare among Romans. Blonde was associated with youth, novelty, and foreignness, especially Germanic captives, which made it both exotic and desirable. Roman women dyed their hair using plant mixtures, ashes, and substances that smelled like a mistake. The scent lingered. Everyone pretended not to notice. Wigs were common, especially among elite women. Some were imported from faraway regions, which meant your hairstyle could quietly announce Rome's global reach. Nothing said empire, quite like wearing someone else's hair from another continent. Men's hair was simpler, but still symbolic. A Roman man's hairstyle was expected to be neat, controlled, and conservative. Too long suggested vanity or Greek influence. Too short suggested military life. Baldness was common and not necessarily shameful, but attempts to hide it were mocked relentlessly. Rome tolerated aging. It did not tolerate denial. Hair, in Rome, was never accidental. It was curated, maintained, judged, and interpreted. Your head was not just your own, it was part of your public image. In ancient Rome, a man's greatest beauty achievement was looking like he hadn't tried too hard. Effort was dangerous. Carelessness was worse. The ideal Roman man had to walk a very narrow path between respectable and suspiciously groomed, and falling off either side invited judgment. Roman masculinity valued control, not decoration. A man who looked too polished risked being seen as vain, indulgent, or morally questionable. Excessive concern with appearance suggested softness, self-obsession, or, the ultimate insult, Greek influence. Rome admired Greek culture in theory and mocked it relentlessly in practice. This meant Roman men were expected to look clean and orderly, but not styled. Hair should be trimmed, not fashionable. Skin should be healthy, not glowing. Clothing should fit well, but not draw attention. If someone noticed your grooming choices, you had already failed. Ironically, this created its own kind of pressure. Roman men still had to meet expectations. They just weren't allowed to acknowledge the effort required to meet them. A man who smelled bad was negligent. A man who smelled too good was suspicious. The ideal scent was neutral dignity, a fragrance category that did not actually exist. Cosmetics for men technically existed, but public opinion discouraged their use. A man who powdered his face or darkened his eyes risked ridicule. Satirists loved mocking men who spent too long in front of mirrors, portraying them as ridiculous, untrustworthy, or secretly unmanly. Rome's message was clear. If you wanted to be admired, you had to pretend admiration didn't matter. Even bathing, which Romans did frequently, was framed as hygiene, not vanity. You bathed to stay clean, not to look attractive. Any overlap between the two was carefully ignored. Grooming was acceptable only if it appeared incidental. Age also played in a man's favour. Unlike women, Roman men were allowed to grow older visibly. Wrinkles suggested experience, grey hair implied wisdom, a lined face meant you had lived, ruled, commanded, or at least survived long enough to be taken seriously. Youthful beauty was fine, but authority aged better. In the end, Roman male beauty was about restraint. You were expected to look capable, composed, and uninterested in being admired, even while everyone was quietly admiring you. In ancient Rome, the most attractive thing a man could project was the illusion that he did not care how he looked. If Roman beauty standards were honest, they would have admitted one thing up front: they were deeply confused about body hair. Early Rome viewed body hair as natural and masculine. A hairy chest suggested strength, maturity, and the ability to endure discomfort without complaining. All excellent Roman traits. But as Rome grew wealthier, more cosmopolitan, and more obsessed with appearances, opinions began to shift. Hair stopped being a sign of rugged virtue and started looking inconvenient. Smooth skin slowly became fashionable, especially among elite men. Hairlessness suggested refinement, leisure, and enough free time to sit still while someone inflicted pain on you in the name of aesthetics. And yes, hair removal in ancient Rome was painful. There were no razors designed for comfort. There were tweezers, pumice stones, resin waxes, and professionals whose entire job was to remove hair while you questioned your life choices. These professionals were called depilators. Their work involved plucking hair one by one, often in public bathhouses, while clients endured the process with stoic silence. Crying was discouraged, complaining was shameful, beauty demanded suffering, and Rome expected you to handle it quietly. But here's the catch. Too much hair removal was suspicious. A man who removed all his body hair risked looking overly groomed, soft, or effeminate. Satirists mocked men who were too smooth, suggesting they spent more time grooming than governing. So Roman men had to remove some hair, but not too much. Enough to look refined, not enough to look like you enjoyed it. This created a delicate balancing act. Hair on the chest? Acceptable. Hair on the back? Less so. Hair in certain intimate areas? Absolutely not discussed, but definitely judged. The correct amount of hair was never specified, but everyone somehow knew when you got it wrong. Women faced similar contradictions. Body hair was considered unfeminine, but hair removal was time-consuming and uncomfortable. Women used waxes and abrasives to achieve smooth skin, again without acknowledging the effort involved. Beauty was supposed to look effortless, even when it very clearly was not. In the end, body hair became another quiet indicator of class. Removing hair required time, tools, and often assistance. If you were smooth, it meant you weren't working all day. If you were hairy, it meant you were busy surviving. In ancient Rome, even your body hair had to follow social rules. And like most Roman rules, they were unwritten, unforgiving, and enforced by everyone. If Roman men were confused about grooming, they were even more anxious about muscles. Strength was admired in ancient Rome, but only the correct kind of strength. The ideal male body was fit, firm, and capable, without ever looking like it required visible effort. Rome respected power, not sweat. If your body looked like it had been earned through hard labor, congratulations, you had accidentally made yourself less respectable. The perfect Roman man had moderate musculature, broad shoulders were good, a strong chest was fine, defined arms suggested discipline, but excessive muscle, that raised questions. Too much bulk implied manual labor, gladiatorial training, or a suspicious amount of time lifting heavy objects instead of issuing commands. Rome preferred bodies that suggested authority, not exertion. This is why statues of Roman statesmen often show idealized but restrained physiques. They're fit, but not intimidating. Strong, but not hulking. Their bodies say, I could fight if necessary. Not, I fight for entertainment. Gladiators were admired, but they were not role models. They were spectacles. Impressive, dangerous, and socially separate. Exercise was encouraged, but discreetly. Roman men trained to stay healthy and ready for military service, but not to sculpt themselves into walking displays. The gymnasium existed, but vanity was frowned upon. You exercised to fulfill your duty, not to admire yourself in reflective surfaces. If you looked like you enjoyed it too much, people noticed. Fatness was also criticized, but carefully. Excess weight suggested indulgence, lack of discipline, and a failure to control appetite, all deeply un-Roman traits. Satirists loved mocking overweight elites, portraying them as greedy, soft, and morally compromised. A thick body implied a thick character. At the same time, being too thin was suspicious as well. Frailty suggested weakness, illness, or a lack of vigor. The ideal body existed in a narrow, unforgiving middle ground, strong but not bulky, lean but not fragile, impressive but not showy, and of course aging shifted expectations. A young man was allowed to look athletic, an older man was expected to look dignified. Muscles mattered less than posture, presence, and confidence. Authority aged better than abs. In the end, the Roman male body wasn't meant to inspire desire. It was meant to inspire confidence, respect, and obedience. In ancient Rome, the ideal body didn't say, "Look at me." It said, "Listen to me." In ancient Rome, faces mattered almost as much as laws, possibly more. You could break a rule and recover. You could not easily recover from having the wrong face. Roman beauty standards placed enormous importance on facial features, not because they were decorative, but because they were believed to reveal leadership potential. A good Roman face looked like it had opinions, experience, and the emotional range of a well-trained statue. Strong noses were admired, especially on men. A prominent nose suggested authority, decisiveness, and a certain talent for issuing orders without asking for feedback. Small or delicate noses were sometimes associated with weakness or excessive refinement, which Rome tolerated only in poetry and children. Jawlines mattered too. A firm jaw implied resolve and self-control. A soft jaw suggested indulgence, laziness, or a troubling relationship with snacks. Roman satirists had a long-standing hobby of mocking men whose faces looked too comfortable, implying their moral discipline had also gone soft. Symmetry was praised, but perfection was suspicious. An overly flawless face looked artificial, as if it had never experienced stress, responsibility, or the crushing weight of empire. Minor imperfections, a slightly crooked nose, a lined forehead, a weathered look suggested maturity and credibility. Rome trusted faces that looked like they had survived things. This is why Roman portrait busts are so honest. Wrinkles are visible, asymmetries are preserved, features are exaggerated rather than softened. These were not flattering selfies, they were political statements. A Roman leader wanted to look experienced, not beautiful. Youth was temporary. Authority was the goal. Women's faces were judged differently. Softness and symmetry were admired, but expressions were expected to remain calm and controlled. Excess emotion distorted the face, which distorted perception. A woman who looked too expressive risked appearing unstable or immoderate, neither of which Rome found charming. Facial expression itself was part of beauty. Raised brows, widened eyes, or dramatic reactions were discouraged. The ideal Roman face looked like it was always one breath away from issuing a measured judgment. In Rome, your face didn't just show who you were, it suggested what you were capable of. And if your features didn't inspire confidence, authority, or restraint, Rome quietly adjusted its expectations, usually downward. Beauty, once again, was not about admiration, it was about command. In ancient Rome, scars were not flaws, they were credentials. A visible scar, especially on a man, was proof that you had lived correctly or at least dangerously enough to impress others. Scars suggested military service, courage, endurance, and the ability to survive situations that very much wanted you dead. In a society built on conquest, a smooth, untouched face sometimes raised more suspicion than admiration. Battle scars were the most prestigious. A mark from a sword, spear, or shield implied that you had stood your ground, followed orders, and not immediately fled when things became unpleasant. All highly respected Roman qualities. A scarred veteran could stand silently in a crowd and let his face do the talking. Rome loved that kind of efficiency. But not all scars were equal. A scar on the front of the body suggested bravery. A scar on the back suggested retreat. Romans noticed the difference. They didn't always say anything, but they noticed, and they remembered. A man with scars on his chest looked like someone who faced danger head-on. A man with scars elsewhere looked like someone who had learned a lesson the fast way. Scars also worked as social proof. You didn't need to explain your past. You didn't need to tell stories. Your body already carried the evidence. In an age without resumes, scars were the original job references. Interestingly, scars could even enhance perceived attractiveness. They added character, seriousness, and credibility. A slightly damaged face suggested experience and authority. things Rome valued far more than smooth perfection. A flawless appearance, especially on an older man, sometimes looked suspicious, as if you had avoided responsibility entirely. Women's scars were judged differently. While scars from childbirth were respected privately, visible marks were rarely celebrated publicly. Roman beauty standards remained harsher on women, who were expected to appear unblemished and composed regardless of life's impact. Experience was admired in men. In women it was often quietly ignored. There was also an unspoken rule: scars had to look earned. A mark from honourable service was respectable. A scar from drunken misbehaviour or public humiliation was not. Rome respected suffering, but only if it served the state. In ancient Rome, scars told a story, and Rome listened carefully. A perfect body might be admired, but a scarred one was believed. In ancient Rome, aging was not a universal experience. It was a gendered privilege. For Roman men, aging was often an upgrade. Grey hair suggested wisdom. Wrinkles implied experience. A lined face meant you had lived, governed, commanded, or at least survived long enough to earn respect. Age transformed a man from potential into authority. The older you looked, the more Rome assumed you knew what you were doing, whether or not this was true. In fact, trying to look too young as a man could be embarrassing. Dyeing grey hair or hiding signs of age suggested insecurity, vanity, or a refusal to accept your role in the social hierarchy. Rome tolerated ambition. It did not tolerate denial. A man was expected to age visibly and wear it like a badge of responsibility. Women unfortunately played by a very different rulebook. Female beauty in Rome was tightly bound to youth. Smooth skin, firm features, and a youthful appearance were celebrated, while visible aging was quietly punished. Roman art froze women in idealized youth. Even when portraying historical figures who had lived long, complicated lives, time was allowed to shape men. Women were expected to resist it indefinitely. This didn't mean Roman women simply accepted aging without protest. Quite the opposite. They fought it with cosmetics, skincare routines, and elaborate grooming. Creams, ointments, oils, and treatments promised smoother skin and restored youth, with the results ranging from mildly helpful to deeply optimistic. But here's the cruel part. A woman who appeared too youthful risks suspicion as well. Excessive effort to hide age could be read as deception or vanity, so women had to age just enough to appear respectable, but not enough to lose social value. Once again, Rome created a narrow path and expected everyone to walk it perfectly. Men, meanwhile, were allowed to grow into power. Their faces gained credibility with time. Their presence carried more weight. Age softened judgments of appearance rather than sharpening them. The message was clear. For men, age added authority. For women, age subtracted value, and Rome enforced this quietly, through expectations, art, and daily social interaction. No speeches, no laws, just constant observation. In ancient Rome, time was kind to men. To women, it was another standard to survive. By now a pattern should be painfully clear. Roman beauty standards were never really about beauty. They were about control. Control of the body, control of behavior, control of how much individuality you were allowed to display before society gently or not so gently corrected you. Rome loved moderation, not too much emotion, not too much pleasure, not too much effort, not too little effort either. The ideal Roman existed in a narrow corridor of acceptability, carefully avoiding both extremes while pretending this came naturally. Beauty was simply the visible proof that you understood the rules and were capable of following them. Self-control was the highest virtue. A beautiful Roman body suggested that appetites were restrained, desires managed, and impulses kept on a short leash. Excess showed on the body, and excess made people nervous. A face that looked indulgent implied a life lived indulgently. A body that looked soft suggested a mind that was soft too. Rome did not appreciate softness unless it was metaphorical and written in poetry. This is why beauty expectations were so strict and so exhausting. You weren't just maintaining an appearance, you were maintaining a reputation. Every cosmetic choice, grooming habit, and physical feature became part of an unspoken argument about whether you deserved respect. And the system worked precisely because it was never officially enforced. There were no beauty laws, no written penalties, just endless observation. Neighbours noticed, friends noticed, strangers noticed, satirists noticed, and made sure everyone else noticed too. The fear of being judged was more effective than any formal punishment. Ironically, the more Rome insisted that beauty should appear effortless, the more effort people invested in achieving it. Hours of grooming were hidden behind a mask of indifference. Painful procedures were endured quietly. Cosmetics were applied carefully and denied publicly. Everyone was performing effortlessness while privately working very hard at it. Even rejecting beauty standards became suspicious. If you didn't care about your appearance at all, people assumed negligence or defiance. If you cared too much, vanity. The correct amount of care was always exactly what Rome expected, even though it never told you what that was. In ancient Rome, beauty wasn't about standing out. It was about fitting in perfectly, and the real goal wasn't admiration. It was approval, silent, constant, and absolute. The cruel genius of Roman beauty standards was that most people were never meant to meet them. On paper, the ideals sounded reasonable. Moderation, balance, restraint, dignity. In practice, they required time, money, servants, leisure, and a body cooperative enough not to age, sweat, scar incorrectly, or react poorly to lead-based cosmetics. Which meant the standards were technically universal, but realistically exclusive. If you were wealthy, beauty was achievable. You had time to avoid the sun. You had servants to style your hair, apply cosmetics, pluck unwanted hair, and tell you when your eyebrows were betraying you. You could rest, eat well, bathe often, and recover quietly from the consequences of toxic makeup. Leisure itself was the foundation of Roman beauty. If you were poor, beauty was mostly theoretical. Working outdoors meant darker skin. Physical labor shaped the body in the wrong ways. Stress carved lines into faces too early. Time spent surviving was time not spent grooming, and Rome interpreted all of this not as circumstance, but as personal failure. The body revealed class, and class was treated as destiny. Enslaved people existed entirely outside the beauty system, unless they were being evaluated as property. Their bodies were judged for usefulness, strength, and market value rather than virtue. Beauty, in that context, became transactional. Aesthetic standards applied only when they benefited someone in power. What made the system particularly effective was that it encouraged comparison rather than rebellion. Instead of questioning the standard itself, people questioned themselves. Why don't I look right? Why does everyone else seem to manage this? The answer, of course, was access, but Rome preferred that you blame your discipline instead. Even those who met the standards lived under pressure. A single mistake, a tan, a wrinkle, a poorly judged hairstyle, could damage reputation. Beauty had to be maintained constantly. You never won, you only avoided losing, and Rome never admitted this openly. The system worked best when it appeared natural. Beauty was framed as virtue, virtue as effort, and effort as choice. If you failed, the logic said, it must have been your fault. In ancient Rome, beauty standards didn't uplift society. They organized it, and they ensured that the same people stayed admired, while everyone else stayed anxious. In ancient Rome, beauty was never something you had. It was something you were constantly defending. There was no finish line, no moment where you achieved the ideal and were left alone. Beauty standards followed you everywhere, into the forum, the baths, your home, and even into old age. Rome watched constantly, quietly, relentlessly, and the judgment never slept. Your body spoke before you did. Your skin announced your class. Your hair revealed your leisure. Your posture suggested your discipline. Your face hinted at your moral reliability. Long before you opened your mouth, Rome had already formed an opinion, and it was rarely generous. This is what made Roman beauty standards so powerful. They weren't enforced by law or decree. They were enforced socially, through glances, gossip, satire, and silence. You didn't need to be told you were failing. You could see it in how people looked at you or didn't. And because the system was invisible, it felt natural. Beauty wasn't framed as oppression. It was framed as virtue, as effort, as personal responsibility. If you failed to meet the standard, Rome didn't say the standard was impossible. Rome said you lacked discipline. That belief kept the hierarchy intact. The wealthy looked beautiful because they had the means to do so. The poor looked unrefined because survival left no time for aesthetics. The outcome was predictable, but the explanation was moral, and moral explanations are very hard to argue with. What's striking is how familiar this all feels. We no longer judge virtue by skin tone in quite the same way. We don't openly link beauty to moral worth, but the pressure remains. Bodies are still read, faces still interpreted. Effortlessness is still praised, even when it's clearly expensive, time-consuming and exhausting. Rome didn't invent beauty standards, but it perfected their use as a social tool. In ancient Rome, beauty wasn't about admiration. It was about conformity, about knowing your place, about being legible to power. And once you understand that, Roman beauty stops feeling ancient. It starts feeling uncomfortably modern. When Marco Polo finally arrived at the court of Kublai Khan, he had already been travelling for nearly 4 years, not sailing comfortably between Mediterranean ports, but moving slowly and painfully across the spine of Asia. Deserts where water vanished for days, mountain passes so high that breathing became a deliberate act, cities whose names meant nothing to Europeans, and whose customs felt almost alien. By the time he reached the Mongol capital, Marco was not just young, he was hardened. The court itself was overwhelming. This was not a barbarian camp as many Europeans imagined the Mongols to be. It was an imperial machine. The palace complex was vast, orderly and meticulously run, surrounded by officials, guards, scribes, translators and servants moving with practiced precision. Gold, silk, lacquered wood and jade appeared everywhere, not as displays of excess but as normal fixtures of power. For a boy from Venice raised among stone buildings and narrow canals, it must have felt like stepping into a different reality altogether. Marco did not arrive alone. He came with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo, merchants who had already met the great Khan years earlier. That prior connection mattered. The Mongol Empire valued loyalty, memory and usefulness. Kublai Khan was not interested in Marco because he was exotic. He was interested because he might be useful. A foreigner with no local alliances could be trusted in ways native officials sometimes could not. The young Venetian was examined closely. He was questioned, observed and tested. He spoke multiple languages, learned quickly, and showed curiosity rather than fear. He listened more than he talked. In a court filled with ambitious men eager to impress, this restraint stood out. Kublai Khan, already ruling the largest empire the world had ever seen, had little patience for arrogance. What he valued was competence. This first meeting was not dramatic in the way legends later made it. There was no instant promotion, no cinematic declaration. Instead, there was something more dangerous and more powerful. Interest. Marco Polo was allowed to stay. He was given time to learn, and in that quiet decision, made deep inside the heart of the Yuan court, the course of his life and eventually Europe's understanding of Asia began to change. Once Marco Polo was permitted to remain at the court of Kublai Khan, survival depended on adaptation. This was not a place where charm alone carried weight. The Yuan court functioned through discipline, hierarchy, and relentless observation. Every official was watched, every report was evaluated, and every outsider was quietly tested to see whether they could become useful or disposable. For Marco Polo, the first real challenge was learning how the empire actually worked. The Mongol state was vast, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe, but it did not rule through chaos. It ruled through systems. Messages travelled by relay stations placed a day's ride apart. Taxes were assessed with brutal efficiency. Records were kept meticulously, often in multiple languages. Marco had never seen bureaucracy on this scale. In Europe, power still clung to land, bloodlines and personal favours. Here, power moved on paper. Marco began as an observer. He watched officials debate logistics, food supply and provincial disputes with cold pragmatism. There was little sentimentality. If a road failed, it was repaired. If an official failed, he was replaced. Loyalty mattered, but competence mattered more. Over time, Marco absorbed this way of thinking. He learned that the empire did not ask whether something was traditional, it asked whether it worked. Language became his most valuable weapon. Marco picked up Mongolian and Persian quickly, and likely some form of Chinese administrative speech. This allowed him to move between worlds inside the court: translators, merchants, tax officials, and military administrators. Each group saw only part of the empire. Marco, by listening to all of them, began to see the whole. Kublai Khan noticed, not because Marco spoke well, but because he reported clearly. When asked about regions he had travelled through, Marco did not embellish. He described roads, crops, cities, and trade goods with practical detail. This was information an emperor could use. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marco shifted from guest to asset. The Mongol court prized foreigners precisely because they had no local loyalties. A Venetian could not be bribed by Chinese clans or Mongol aristocrats. His survival depended entirely on the Khan's favour. That made him reliable, dangerous perhaps, but reliable. By the end of these early years, Marco Polo was no longer just learning about the empire. He was learning to see the world the way the empire did, as territory to be measured, governed and connected. And once you learn to see like that, you are no longer merely a traveller. You become part of the machine itself. Once Marco Polo proved that he could observe clearly and report honestly, Kublai Khan did something far more revealing than granting him a title. He sent him away. In the Mongol world, trust was not shown by keeping someone close, but by giving them responsibility far from the centre of power. Marco was dispatched across the empire on official business, sometimes as a messenger, sometimes as an inspector. These journeys were not ceremonial. Marco travelled through northern China, Yunnan, Tibet, and possibly Burma, moving along routes that few Europeans would see for centuries. He encountered cities larger than anything in Europe, regions with their own laws and customs, and administrative systems that functioned with astonishing regularity. Everywhere he went, he saw the same imperial fingerprint: standardized taxation, regulated markets, and officials accountable to a distant but very real authority. What struck Marco most was how connected everything was. The empire moved information with speed. Relay stations supplied fresh horses, food and lodging for imperial travelers. Orders issued in the capital could reach the far provinces in days rather than months. Compared to Europe's slow, fragmented kingdoms, this felt almost unnatural, as if the empire itself were alive and thinking. Marco's role was to look, listen, and report. He noted agricultural practices, mineral resources, trade goods, and population patterns. He described salt production, coal usage, and river transport in careful detail. This was not sightseeing, this was intelligence gathering. And Marco, intentionally or not, became a living extension of the Khan's eyes. His foreignness continued to protect him. Local officials could not easily manipulate him, and they knew his reports went directly upward. That made him both respected and quietly resented. To be visited by a foreigner backed by the Khan was a reminder that the centre always watched the edges. Over time, Marco grew comfortable moving through cultures that would have terrified most Europeans. He learned how to behave in Muslim courts, Buddhist monasteries, and Mongol military camps without offending anyone, or at least without offending the wrong people. He adapted his clothing, manners, and expectations. Home became an abstract idea. These years of travel changed Marco permanently. He stopped thinking like a Venetian merchant and started thinking like an imperial official. The world to him was no longer mysterious or monstrous. It was organized, governed, measurable, and that realization that the world could be run this way would later shock Europe far more than tales of silk or gold ever could. After years of travel, Marco Polo was no longer treated as a temporary envoy. By the time he returned regularly to the capital, he had become something far rarer, a foreigner trusted inside the inner machinery of the Yuan state. The empire did not elevate people with ceremony, it absorbed them quietly. Marco found himself attending administrative discussions, delivering reports in person, and observing how imperial decisions were actually made. What impressed him most was not the Khan's authority, but the system that supported it. Kublai Khan ruled through delegation. He relied on layers of officials who specialized in finance, agriculture, military logistics, and law. Decisions were recorded, reviewed, and enforced with consistency. This was not rule by impulse, it was rule by process. For a European accustomed to feudal lords acting on personal whim, this level of organization felt almost unsettling. Marco witnessed how taxation worked in practice. Revenue was collected not only in coin but in grain, textiles, and labor. Storehouses were filled strategically to support cities and armies alike. When famine threatened one region, supplies were redirected from another. The empire did not eliminate suffering, but it managed it, and that distinction mattered. Stability, not morality, was the ultimate goal. One of the most startling elements Marco encountered was paper money, issued by the state and backed by authority rather than precious metal. It circulated across the empire with astonishing trust. Refusing it was illegal, accepting it was unavoidable. To Marco, raised in a world where gold and silver defined value, this felt like magic enforced by law, yet it worked. Markets thrived, taxes flowed, and trade moved faster than ever. Marco also observed the justice system, which was severe but predictable. Punishments were harsh, but corruption was punished just as severely. Officials lived with constant awareness that failure could cost them everything. Fear, in this system, was not a flaw, it was a tool. As a foreigner, Marco remained both inside and outside this world. He could never fully belong, but he was allowed to understand. That position gave him clarity. He saw the empire not as propaganda or myth, but as an operating structure, one designed to control enormous distances and diverse peoples. By this stage, Marco Polo was no longer just recording wonders. He was witnessing something far more dangerous to European assumptions, proof that a non-Christian, non-European power could govern more effectively than anything the West had yet imagined. As Marco Polo moved deeper into the Yuan world, it was the cities that left the strongest impression. Not their beauty alone, but their scale. Cities in China were not clusters of buildings surrounded by fields. They were vast organisms, carefully planned and densely populated, functioning at a level of complexity that Europe simply did not possess at the time. Marco struggled to find comparisons that would make sense to his future readers because none truly existed. The greatest of these was the capital itself, a city laid out with precision and intention. Wide avenues allowed traffic to move efficiently. Districts were organized by function, separating markets, residences, and administrative centers. Canals and waterways brought food directly into the city, reducing reliance on long overland transport. Grain arrived steadily, not as emergency relief but as routine supply. To Marco, this was the difference between survival and stability. Markets astonished him most. Goods flowed in from across Asia. Silk, spices, porcelain, metals, and rare woods. Prices were regulated, weights and measures were standardized. Fraud was punished quickly. Trade here was not chaotic bargaining in muddy squares. It was structured commerce, overseen by the state. The result was prosperity that felt almost industrial in its efficiency. Marco also noticed the invisible systems that kept these cities alive. Night patrols maintained order. Fire brigades stood ready. Public works were maintained continuously rather than repaired only after collapse. These details rarely appear in legends, but they mattered more than palaces ever could. A city that functions is more impressive than a city that dazzles. The contrast with Europe haunted him. In Venice, even the richest cities struggled with overcrowding, disease, and unreliable supply. Here, cities far larger operated with fewer visible breakdowns. This was not because the people were superior, but because the system was. Living among these cities changed Marco's sense of normal. Monumental scale became routine. Administrative discipline became expected. The idea that civilization could be deliberately engineered rather than inherited or improvised took root in his thinking. When Marco later described these cities to Europeans, many dismissed his accounts as exaggeration. They assumed he lied because the truth was more threatening, that the center of the world was not where they thought it was. In Yuan China, Marco Polo saw urban life not as a fragile achievement, but as something that could be maintained, expanded, and controlled. And once you have seen cities like that, it becomes impossible to believe that Europe was the natural pinnacle of human organization. What truly convinced Marco Polo that he was living inside something unprecedented was not the palaces or the cities, but the systems that bound everything together. The Yuan Empire functioned less like a collection of territories and more like a network. Roads, paperwork, and rules moved power farther and faster than armies alone ever could. The postal system was the backbone of this network. Relay stations dotted the empire at regular intervals, stocked with fresh horses, food, and lodging for official travelers. Couriers could cross vast distances in days, not weeks. Orders flowed outward. Information flowed back. For Marco, raised in a Europe where kings often ruled blindly beyond their immediate lands, this felt almost supernatural. The emperor did not guess what was happening. He was told paper ruled this empire in another sense as well. Administrative documents tracked population, taxation, land use, and labor obligations. Nothing was perfect, but everything was recorded. This reduced disputes and limited local power grabs. Officials could not simply invent numbers when the center demanded proof. Paper, here, was authority made visible. Then there was paper money, the detail that would later make Europeans laugh and accuse Marco of fantasy. Issued by the state, stamped with imperial seals and backed by law, it circulated everywhere. Merchants accepted it without question. Taxes were paid in it. Refusal meant punishment. Value no longer depended on metal dug from the ground, but on trust enforced by the state. To Marco, this was not magic. It was control. Roads completed the picture, maintained continuously, guarded when necessary, and integrated with canals and rivers. They allowed goods and people to move with remarkable efficiency. Grain from the south fed northern cities. Luxury goods traveled outward to border regions. Military supplies followed predictable routes. Chaos was minimized through planning. As someone who traveled these roads under imperial authority, Marco experienced the empire as it intended to be experienced. Smooth, reliable, and intimidatingly organized. This was not accidental. It was designed to make resistance feel pointless. For Marco, the realization was unsettling. Europe's strength lay in tradition, faith, and inheritance. The Yuan Empire's strength lay in logistics. It did not ask who you were. It asked what you produced, where you lived, and how efficiently you served the system. This chapter of Marco's life taught him something dangerous, that power could be built not just with swords, but with roads, paper, and rules. And once that lesson is learned, it becomes impossible to unlearn. For all his usefulness, Marco Polo never forgot that his position at the Yuan court existed on borrowed time. The favor of Kublai Khan was real, but it was also conditional. The empire trusted foreigners because they had no roots and distrusted them for the same reason. Marco lived inside that contradiction for years. By now he had served in multiple administrative roles and completed long assignments far from the capital. Some later accounts claim he acted as a tax official or regional administrator, though titles in the Mongol system were fluid and rarely matched European expectations. What mattered was not rank but access. Marco could speak directly to powerful officials, his reports were read, his presence carried authority. That alone placed him in a dangerous middle ground. At court, alliances shifted constantly. Mongol aristocrats, Chinese administrators, Muslim financiers, and foreign advisors all competed for influence. No one ruled alone, not even the emperor. Marco learned to keep his distance from factional struggles. Taking sides was unnecessary and fatal. Survival depended on usefulness without visibility. Kublai Khan's interest in Marco remained pragmatic. He valued Marco's knowledge of distant regions and his ability to move without provoking local resistance. But the Khan did not grant intimacy lightly. Marco was trusted, not embraced. He was inside the system, not inside the family. That distinction mattered more with each passing year. As time passed, the empire itself began to change. Kublai Khan was aging. Succession loomed quietly behind every decision. When an empire reaches that stage, loyalty becomes fragile. Officials plan for futures beyond the current ruler. Marco, with no dynasty and no heirs in the empire, felt the ground slowly shifting beneath him. For the first time, the idea of leaving took shape, not as escape, but as necessity. Marco had spent much of his adult life serving a power that was not his own. He had gained knowledge, status, and protection, but none of it was permanent. One change at the top could erase everything. This realization did not come with panic. It came with clarity. Marco understood empires well enough now to know when a chapter was closing. Favor had limits, trust had boundaries, and for a foreigner who had seen too much and traveled too far, the safest moment to leave was before he was no longer needed. The empire had taught him how power worked. It would also teach him when to walk away. After nearly 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, Marco Polo did not simply decide to leave. Departure from the Yuan court was not a personal choice. It required imperial approval, careful timing, and a reason that did not resemble abandonment. For years, Kublai Khan resisted the idea. Marco had become too useful, too informed, and too familiar with the inner workings of the empire. The opportunity finally came in the form of diplomacy. A Mongol princess was to be escorted west to marry a ruler of the Ilkhanate, strengthening alliances within the fractured Mongol world. The journey would be long, dangerous, and primarily maritime. Marco, his father Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo were assigned to accompany the expedition. It was framed not as a departure, but as service. That distinction made all the difference. The voyage itself was brutal. Leaving from southern Chinese ports, the fleet crossed the South China Sea, passed through Southeast Asia, and moved across the Indian Ocean. Storms wrecked ships. Disease spread among the crew. Of the hundreds who began the journey, only a fraction survived to reach their destination. Marco later described this journey with noticeably less wonder than his time at court. The romance of empire fades quickly at sea. By the time the Polos reached Persia, the political landscape had shifted yet again. The intended groom had died, and the marriage arrangements were altered. The Mongol world Marco had known was fragmenting into rival centers of power. Unity, once enforced by sheer momentum, was beginning to strain. From there the Polos continued west overland, retracing routes they had not seen in nearly 2 decades. Cities had changed, trade patterns had shifted. Marco himself had changed most of all. He was no longer a Venetian merchant in training. He was an imperial veteran returning to a continent that had no idea what he had seen. When Marco finally returned to Venice, he was a stranger in his own city. He dressed differently, spoke differently, and thought differently. Europe felt small, disorganized, and aggressively ignorant of the world beyond its borders. The silence surrounding Asia in European knowledge was no longer neutral to him. It felt deliberate. The long road home did not end Marco Polo's journey. It only changed its direction. What he carried back was not silk or gold, but experience, and that would prove far more disruptive than any cargo. When Marco Polo finally settled back into life in Venice, the greatest challenge he faced was not reintegration, it was disbelief. Europe had not changed in his absence. Its horizons were still narrow, its maps still vague, its assumptions still firm. Marco returned with memories of an empire that ran on paper, roads and logistics, and he quickly learned that such a world was almost impossible to explain to people who had never left their region, let alone their continent. His stories did not circulate immediately. They surfaced after his capture during a war between Venice and Genoa, when Marco found himself imprisoned. There, with time and an audience, he dictated his experiences to a writer. What emerged was not meant to be fantasy. It was an attempt to translate an unfamiliar reality into words Europeans could grasp. Cities with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. Money made of paper, coal used as fuel, officials appointed for skill rather than birth. An emperor ruling more land than any Christian king could imagine. Many listeners assumed exaggeration, some assumed lies, others assumed Marco had been deceived by clever foreigners. It was easier to dismiss the account than to accept its implications. If Marco was right, then Europe was not the center of the world. It was a peripheral region, technologically behind and administratively primitive compared to what existed in Asia. And yet the book endured. Merchants read it for trade routes. Mapmakers read it for geography. Adventurers read it for possibility. Even skeptics could not ignore the consistency of Marco's descriptions. He did not describe miracles. He described systems. That ultimately made his account dangerous, because systems can be copied. Marco Polo never returned to Asia. He lived out his life as a wealthy Venetian, occasionally mocked, occasionally admired, often misunderstood. But his real legacy was not personal fame, it was perspective. He forced Europe to confront the idea that greatness could exist outside its own traditions and faith. Centuries later, explorers would sail west and south carrying distorted echoes of Marco's words, searching for the wealth and order he described. By then, the Yuan Empire had fallen, but the idea it planted that the world was far larger, more complex, and more organized than Europe had believed could not be undone. Marco Polo did not conquer anything. He did something far more disruptive. He reported what he saw. Few love letters in history feel as exposed as those written by Napoleon Bonaparte to Josephine. They are not elegant declarations meant for posterity. They are raw, impatient, and almost uncomfortable to read, because they were never meant to be read by anyone else. Napoleon wrote them while campaigning, moving constantly, surrounded by soldiers, maps, mud, and the pressure of command. And yet, between orders and battles, his thoughts collapsed inward toward one person he could not control. His letters to Josephine de Beauharnais swing wildly in tone. One moment he is tender, longing, and vulnerable. The next he is jealous, accusatory, and wounded. He begs her to write more often. He counts the days since her last letter. He imagines her absence in obsessive detail. This is not the calm voice of a man secure in love. This is the voice of someone terrified of losing it. What makes these letters so striking is the imbalance of power they reveal. Napoleon, who commanded armies and reshaped Europe, had almost no authority in his marriage. Josephine was older, socially skilled, and emotionally distant. She moved easily through Parisian salons while Napoleon marched across continents. The more powerful he became publicly, the more helpless he seemed privately. His letters read less like romantic gestures and more like emotional supply lines, fragile threads keeping him connected to a world he feared was moving on without him. There is very little poetry in his writing. Instead, there is urgency, short sentences, repetition, demands disguised as affection. He complains when she does not write. He imagines betrayal without evidence. He oscillates between devotion and resentment, sometimes within the same page. These are not the letters of a mythic hero. They are the letters of a man who cannot sit still with uncertainty. And that is precisely why they endure. Napoleon's love letters do not flatter the reader. They unsettle. They show how love can strip away discipline and strategy, leaving only need. They also reveal something uncomfortable about history's great figures. Ambition does not cancel insecurity. If anything, it amplifies it. In the end, these letters did not save the marriage. Josephine remained distant, and Napoleon eventually divorced her for political reasons. But the ink survived, and within it remains a reminder that even the most controlled lives can unravel in private, especially when love refuses to obey the rules of empire. If Napoleon's letters expose hunger, the letters of Frida Kahlo expose pain, unfiltered, unapologetic, and deliberately visible. Frida did not write love letters to soothe or reassure. She wrote to reveal. Her letters to Diego Rivera read like emotional self-portraits, composed with the same brutal honesty found in her paintings. Frida's love for Diego was not gentle. It was obsessive, cyclical, and deeply entangled with suffering. Their relationship was marked by infidelity, separation, reunion, and constant emotional friction. Frida knew Diego would betray her. She expected it, and yet she continued to write to him, not to pretend the pain did not exist, but to place it directly in his hands. Her letters are lyrical, but never decorative. She mixes tenderness with accusation, devotion with self-awareness. She writes about her body breaking down, about surgeries, miscarriages, and chronic pain, and then pivots suddenly to desire. Love for Frida was inseparable from physical suffering. She did not separate romance from reality. She fused them. What makes her letters remarkable is their lack of self-censorship. Frida does not attempt to appear strong, virtuous, or composed. She admits jealousy. She admits dependency. She admits rage. But she also claims her agency. Even when pleading, she refuses to shrink. Her love letters are not performances meant to win approval. They are declarations of existence. This is who I am, this is how I feel, and I will not dilute it. Unlike Napoleon, Frida did not write from a position of outward power. Her authority came from honesty. She understood that Diego might not change. She understood that love might not save her. And yet she wrote anyway, not because she believed letters could fix him, but because they allowed her to articulate herself fully. In this way, Frida's love letters feel modern. They anticipate a world where emotional truth matters more than idealized romance. They refuse fantasy. They insist on complexity. Love in her writing is not redemptive. It is consuming. contradictory and real. These letters endure because they do not ask the reader to admire the relationship. They ask the reader to witness it. Frida Kahlo turned private correspondence into emotional evidence, proof that love does not need to be beautiful to be honest, and that honesty itself can be an act of defiance. Among all famous love letters, none are as enigmatic as the letter addressed simply to the immortal beloved, written by Ludwig van Beethoven in the summer of 1812. Unlike Napoleon's frantic pages or Frida Kahlo's emotional exposure, this letter was never sent. It was found after Beethoven's death, folded carefully among his private papers, as if preserved not for its recipient, but for himself. The letter is intense, contradictory, and restless. Beethoven writes in bursts, shifting rapidly between devotion and despair. He speaks of love as something eternal and impossible at the same time. He longs for union, yet accepts separation as unavoidable. Ever thine, ever mine, ever ours, he writes. A line that has echoed through centuries precisely because it resolves nothing. It promises everything while explaining nothing. What makes the letter extraordinary is its context. Beethoven wrote it while travelling, emotionally isolated, increasingly deaf, and deeply frustrated by a world that could hear his music but not understand him. Love here becomes both refuge and torment. The immortal beloved is portrayed not as a fantasy, but as a real woman constrained by circumstance, social barriers, marriage, distance, or all three. Beethoven does not challenge these obstacles directly. He mourns them. The mystery of the beloved's identity has fueled endless speculation. Scholars have proposed several women, each plausible, none definitive, but the unresolved question may be the point. The letter is less about who she was, and more about who Beethoven became when writing to her. Stripped of public reputation and artistic legacy, he appears fragile, needy, and profoundly human. Unlike conventional love letters, this one does not seek reassurance. It does not ask for a reply. It exists in a suspended emotional state, hovering between hope and resignation. Beethoven seems to understand that love for him may never be lived fully, only expressed, imagined, and endured. That restraint gives the letter its power. There is no jealousy, no accusation, no drama directed outward. The struggle is entirely internal. Love becomes something private and absolute, untouched by public life or social expectation. In a sense, the immortal beloved belongs only to the letter itself. Beethoven's music would later be celebrated for its emotional depth and tension. This letter reveals where that intensity lived when sound failed him. It shows that even genius does not clarify love. Sometimes it only makes its absence louder, preserved forever in ink, unanswered and unresolved. Long before modern romance, the letters between Peter Abelard and Heloise captured something far more enduring than passion, love that survives catastrophe. Their correspondence does not glow with youthful infatuation. It aches with memory, regret, and intellectual intimacy forged in the aftermath of disaster. Abelard was one of the most brilliant minds of 12th century Europe. Confident, celebrated, and controversial. Heloise was his student, but also his equal, intellectually gifted, fiercely articulate, and emotionally lucid. Their affair, secret and intense, ended in scandal. When Heloise became pregnant and their relationship was exposed, Abelard was brutally punished. Castrated by agents of her family, he retreated into monastic life. Heloise, at his urging, entered a convent. What followed was not silence, but letters. Years later, when Heloise read Abelard's account of his sufferings, she wrote to him, and what she wrote is astonishing. She does not pretend holiness erased desire. She admits that even in prayer she thinks of him. She confesses that her vows were acts of obedience, not devotion. Love for her had not ended. It had simply been redirected inward. Abelard's letters are restrained, philosophical, and self-protective. He urges spiritual reflection. He reframes their suffering as divine correction. Heloise refuses this framing. She insists on emotional truth. Where Abelard intellectualizes, Heloise remembers. Where he seeks redemption, she seeks recognition of what was lost. This imbalance gives their correspondence its power. These are not symmetrical love letters. They are arguments about memory, meaning, and whether love can be transformed into something holy without becoming a lie. Heloise writes with startling clarity, unashamed of desire, even decades later. Abelard, once fearless, now hides behind doctrine. Their letters endure because they refuse resolution. There is no reunion, no reconciliation, no romantic closure. Instead, there is endurance. Love becomes something lived alongside duty, not replaced by it. Heloise's voice in particular feels modern, insisting that emotional truth does not disappear simply because society demands silence. In preserving these letters, history preserved a radical idea that love does not end when bodies are separated, nor when lives are ruined. Sometimes, it simply learns how to speak from a distance, painfully, Intelligently, and without illusion, the letters between Zelda Fitzgerald and F. Scott Fitzgerald read like a relationship caught in motion, dazzling, unstable, and slowly coming apart. Unlike grand historical romances shaped by distance or tragedy, theirs unfolded in public view, under the pressure of fame, money, and expectation. In their early letters, love feels electric. Scott writes with admiration and hunger, convinced that Zelda embodies everything modern and intoxicating. Zelda responds with wit, flirtation, and a sharp awareness of her own power. They fall in love quickly, recklessly, and with the certainty of youth that assumes passion can sustain itself indefinitely. But as Scott's career accelerated, their correspondence shifted. Success brought insecurity. Scott wrote while drinking heavily, alternating between devotion and paranoia. He needed reassurance constantly, yet resented Zelda's independence. Zelda, meanwhile, struggled to be seen as more than inspiration. She wrote about suffocation, boredom, and the sense that her identity was being consumed by Scott's ambitions. Their letters become increasingly fragmented, emotionally and stylistically. Arguments spill onto the page. Apologies arrive late or not at all. Affection becomes conditional. Love, once playful, turns transactional. Scott worries about Zelda's behavior. Zelda worries about disappearing. Mental illness enters their correspondence quietly at first, then unmistakably. Zelda's letters reveal confusion, longing, and flashes of brilliance. Scott's letters shift toward control, fear, and guilt. He loves her, but he also fears her unpredictability and what it might cost him professionally. What makes these letters so difficult to read is their honesty. There is no villain. There is only incompatibility magnified by circumstance. Love did not fail because it was insincere. It failed because it could not survive the weight placed on it. Unlike mythic love stories, the Fitzgerald letters do not end with resolution or dignity. They fade into separation, hospitalization, and regret. Yet they endure because they document something rarely preserved. How love erodes under pressure, not in dramatic collapse but in daily misunderstanding. Their correspondence captures the modern dilemma of intimacy in public life, how affection can be both fuel and casualty of ambition. In the end, Zelda and Scott loved each other deeply, imperfectly, and destructively, and their letters remain as fragments of a relationship that burned brightly, briefly, and without protection from itself. The love letters between Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West are remarkable, not for secrecy but for audacity. Written in the early 20th century, their correspondence unfolds in a world that offered no clear language for same-sex love, and yet neither woman wrote as if asking for permission. Their letters move confidently between affection, desire, admiration, and playful dominance, refusing to disguise intimacy as mere friendship. Virginia's letters are rhythmic, imaginative, and teasing. She invents metaphors, adopts exaggerated tones, and allows herself emotional freedom rarely visible in her public persona. Writing to Vita, Virginia becomes lighter, flirtatious, and oddly fearless. She mocks herself, mocks Vita, and then confesses longing with sudden seriousness. Love in these letters feels like intellectual play sharpened into desire. Vita's letters, by contrast, are direct and unapologetic. She writes with confidence, sometimes possessiveness, and little concern for convention. Where Virginia circles emotions through language, Vita names them. She wants Virginia. She enjoys wanting her. She does not apologize for it. This dynamic, Virginia's lyrical hesitation paired with Vita's emotional certainty, gives their correspondence its charge. Their love existed alongside marriages that both women maintained. This was not secrecy born of shame, but negotiation within constraint. The letters show how love adapts when it cannot occupy a single, exclusive role. Affection becomes layered rather than denied. Desire coexists with duty. Neither woman pretends this is simple. What makes these letters endure is their balance of seriousness and humor. Virginia writes of missing Vita with theatrical exaggeration, only to undercut it moments later. She understands love's absurdity and embraces it. Vita responds with warmth and steadiness, grounding Virginia when her emotions threaten to spiral. This relationship did not destroy either woman. It enriched them. Virginia's novel Orlando was inspired by Vita, a love letter disguised as literature, playful and eternal. In this sense, their correspondence did not merely record intimacy, it transformed it into art. Unlike many historical love letters shaped by loss or impossibility, these letters radiate mutual recognition. They show what love can look like when freed from expectation of permanence or ownership, intense, sustaining, and honest within its limits. Their ink preserves not tragedy, but permission to love fully, even when the world has no category for it. The love letters written by Franz Kafka to Melanie Jedrzejewska do not feel like romance in the traditional sense. They feel like crisis documents. Kafka did not write to seduce or reassure. He wrote because not writing felt unbearable. Each letter reads like a report from the edge of himself, drafted in a state of emotional emergency. Kafka and Milena rarely saw each other. Their relationship existed mostly on paper, and that distance intensified everything. Kafka writes compulsively, sometimes multiple letters a day, dissecting his own thoughts as they occur. He questions his right to love, his capacity to be loved, and his ability to exist alongside another person. Love for Kafka is not a refuge. It is a magnifying glass held over every fear he already possesses. What makes these letters so unsettling is their self-awareness. Kafka understands that his intensity is overwhelming. He warns Milena about himself even as he clings to her. He oscillates between longing for closeness and insisting that separation is safer for both of them. There is no illusion of romantic destiny here, only anxiety sharpened by intelligence. Milena, unlike Kafka, is grounded. She responds with warmth, clarity, and patience. She does not mirror his spirals. Instead, she absorbs them, offering steadiness without condescension. This imbalance shapes the correspondence. Kafka's letters grow longer, denser, more confessional. Milena's replies, though fewer, carry emotional weight through restraint. Illness haunts the margins of these letters. Kafka's tuberculosis worsens as the correspondence deepens. He writes about weakness, exhaustion, and the feeling that his body is already withdrawing from life. Love becomes entangled with mortality. He fears not only losing Milena, but burdening her. Desire becomes inseparable from guilt. Unlike many famous love letters, Kafka's do not idealize the beloved. Milena is not transformed into an abstraction. She remains real, a woman with her own life, obligations, and limits. What Kafka cannot reconcile is his own inability to meet those limits without pain. These letters endure because they capture something rarely preserved so honestly, the inner life of a person who experiences love as both salvation and threat. Kafka does not conquer his fear, he documents it, and in doing so he reveals a version of intimacy built not on confidence but on exposure. Love in Kafka's ink is not comforting, it is clarifying, and sometimes clarity is the most terrifying thing of all. The love letters written by Oscar Wilde to Lord Alfred Douglas, known as Bosie, are among the most tragic in literary history, not because they are sentimental, but because they trace love as it collapses under obsession, power imbalance, and social punishment. These letters are not gentle exchanges between equals. They are pleas, confessions, and self-erasing declarations written by a man losing everything. Wilde's early letters to Bosie glow with indulgence. He flatters, praises, and aestheticizes him, turning desire into art. Bosie becomes muse, prince, and catastrophe all at once. Wilde frames love as devotion, and devotion as surrender. Even when Bosie is cruel, dismissive, or manipulative, Wilde bends toward reconciliation. He confuses endurance with loyalty. As their relationship deteriorates, the tone shifts. Wilde's later letters, especially those written during imprisonment, abandon performance. They are stripped of wit. In De Profundis, written from prison, love is no longer glamorous. It is examined ruthlessly. Wilde admits his failures, his blindness, and the cost of loving someone who did not protect him when it mattered most. What makes these letters unbearable is Wilde's awareness. He understands that Bosie contributed to his downfall, yet he refuses to fully sever emotional attachment. He writes not to accuse, but to understand. He reframes suffering as spiritual education, attempting to salvage meaning from humiliation and loss. Love becomes something that must be redefined in order to survive at all. Unlike many romantic letters, Wilde's do not seek reunion. They seek transformation. He no longer asks Bosie to love him back. He asks him to understand what their love destroyed and what it revealed. Wilde writes from a place where reputation, freedom, and comfort have already been stripped away. All that remains is reflection. These letters endure because they document love after consequence. Not love as fantasy, but love as aftermath. Wilde shows what happens when affection collides with a society determined to punish it. He also shows how love, even when destructive, can become a source of insight rather than denial. Oscar Wilde's letters from prison are not romantic in the traditional sense. They are honest, and in that honesty lies their quiet power, proof that even when love ruins a life, it can still teach a mind how to see clearly. The love letters of John Keats to Fanny Brawne are shaped by restraint rather than excess. Unlike letters fueled by scandal or obsession, Keats' correspondence is marked by longing held under pressure, desire disciplined by illness, poverty, and the knowledge that time was running out. Keats loved Fanny intensely, but he could not offer her stability. He had no secure income, no established reputation during much of their relationship, and increasingly fragile health. Tuberculosis haunted him quietly at first, then unmistakably. His letters carry the tension of someone who feels deeply but refuses to pretend that love alone can solve material reality. What makes these letters so powerful is their self-control. Keats does not dramatize his suffering for effect. He writes with clarity about his emotional dependence, even when it frightens him. At times he pulls back deliberately, afraid that his intensity will overwhelm Fanny or bind her to a future he cannot give. Love here is not indulgence, it is responsibility. Keats oscillates between closeness and distance. One letter burns with affection and jealousy, the next insists on restraint and silence. He understands that writing to Fanny sustains him, and also destabilizes him. Love becomes both medicine and illness. Unlike Kafka, Keats does not spiral endlessly. He pauses, he edits himself. He tries to protect her even as he confesses how much he needs her. Fanny's replies do not survive in equal number, which gives Keats's letters a monologue-like quality. We hear his voice clearly, but hers only in echoes. This imbalance deepens the sense of vulnerability. Keats writes into uncertainty, never fully sure how his words land. As his health declines, the letters grow heavier. He speaks openly of death, not with melodrama, but with resignation. He knows he may never marry Fanny. He knows he may be remembered for his poetry rather than his love, and yet he continues to write not to promise a future, but to honor the present emotion while it exists. These letters endure because they show love practiced with awareness of limits. Keats does not believe love must conquer everything. He believes it must be honest about what it cannot conquer. In his ink, longing becomes an ethical act, felt deeply, expressed carefully, and accepted without illusion. In preserving these letters, history preserved a quieter truth, that some of the most profound love stories are not the loudest ones, but the ones that know when to hold back and do so anyway, with grace. When Hagia Sophia was completed in the 6th century, it was not meant to be admired quietly. It was designed to overwhelm the senses and humble the soul. The building rose in the heart of Constantinople, like a challenge to gravity itself, its vast dome appearing to float above the city rather than rest upon it. To those who entered for the first time, the effect was deliberate. This was not just a church, but an imitation of heaven rendered in stone, light and gold. The project was commissioned by Justinian I, a ruler obsessed with legacy. Justinian did not want a beautiful building. He wanted the ultimate one. According to later accounts, when construction was finished, he is said to have declared that he had surpassed Solomon. Whether the words were spoken or not hardly matters. The building itself made the claim. No Christian structure had ever attempted something on this scale. What made Hagia Sophia revolutionary was not only its size, but its engineering. Architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus fused Roman construction techniques with daring mathematical innovation. The dome was supported not by heavy walls but by pendentives that transferred its weight downward, creating the illusion that it hovered effortlessly. Light poured in through windows at its base, dissolving the boundary between architecture and atmosphere. The dome did not crush the space beneath it, it opened it. Inside, surfaces shimmered. Marble from across the empire lined the walls, each slab chosen for its veining, symmetry and colour. Golden mosaics reflected candlelight endlessly, blurring edges and softening sound. The interior did not feel solid, it felt alive. Chanting voices did not echo harshly, but lingered, as if absorbed into the building itself. Hagia Sophia was built quickly by ancient standards, rising in just a few years, driven by imperial urgency and limitless resources. It stood not only as a place of worship, but as proof that the Byzantine Empire was the rightful heir of Rome, chosen by God, protected by engineering, and centered in this city between worlds. From the moment its doors opened, Hagia Sophia became more than a church. It became a statement that heaven could be approached, if only briefly, through human hands guided by divine ambition. Once Hagia Sophia began functioning as the primary cathedral of Constantinople, it quickly became the spiritual heartbeat of the Byzantine Empire. This was not a quiet neighborhood church. It was where emperors were crowned, victories were celebrated, and disasters were interpreted as divine messages. Religion here was inseparable from power, and worship unfolded on a scale meant to remind everyone of that truth. The interior was designed as much for sound as for sight. Byzantine chants did not rely on instruments. Human voices filled the space alone, rising upward into the dome and lingering there. The acoustics transformed prayer into something physical. Words stretched, overlapped and dissolved, creating an atmosphere where time felt suspended. Worshippers did not simply listen, they were immersed. Imperial ceremonies amplified this effect. When the emperor entered Hagia Sophia, he did not walk as a private believer. He processed as God's chosen ruler on earth. Incense clouded the air. Silk garments brushed marble floors. Choirs sang in deliberate rhythm as if aligning the empire itself to the liturgy. In that moment, political authority felt sanctified. To oppose the emperor was to resist divine order. The clergy of Hagia Sophia were among the most influential figures in the empire. Patriarchs preached beneath the dome, their words carrying weight far beyond theology. Disputes over doctrine were not academic arguments. They shaped law, loyalty, and rebellion. When theological conflicts erupted, Hagia Sophia often became their stage. Councils were convened, pronouncements were issued. The building witnessed both unity and fracture. Over centuries, the cathedral endured earthquakes, riots, and iconoclastic movements that stripped images from its walls. Icons were destroyed, restored, and destroyed again, as emperors and bishops clashed over the nature of representation itself. Even then, the structure remained. Its walls absorbed each shift in belief without losing their authority. For ordinary citizens, Hagia Sophia was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. Few could fully understand the rituals performed there, but everyone understood their importance. This was where heaven listened most closely, where prayers mattered more, where the empire spoke to God and believed God answered. In these centuries, Hagia Sophia did not merely house worship. It produced it. The building shaped how faith sounded, felt, and moved through space. Long before it became a symbol of conquest or controversy, it was first and foremost a living instrument, one through which an empire tried to hear itself speak in the voice of the divine. For all its grandeur, Hagia Sophia existed in a city that was never stable. Constantinople stood at the crossroads of continents, faiths, and ambitions, and its greatest monument could not remain untouched by conflict. Long before its famous transformation, the building endured centuries of pressure, political, religious, and physical, that tested whether it could survive at all. Riots were among its earliest threats. Religious and political factions often clashed violently in the streets, and Hagia Sophia was frequently drawn into the chaos. During periods of unrest, crowds flooded the cathedral seeking refuge, turning a place of worship into a shelter of last resort. Fires broke out nearby more than once, and each time the structure was scarred, repaired, and reinforced. Survival became part of its identity. Earthquakes posed an even greater danger. The daring engineering that made the dome seem weightless also made it vulnerable. Several times, sections of the dome collapsed, sending stone crashing into the nave below. Each collapse was interpreted not only as a structural failure, but as a spiritual warning. Repairs were rushed, prayers intensified, and architects were summoned to strengthen what had seemed impossibly strong. Buttresses were added, angles adjusted. Hagia Sophia learned to adapt. Religious conflict left marks less visible but no less profound. During the period of iconoclasm, sacred images were removed or destroyed under imperial orders. Walls once covered in golden saints were left bare, stripped of faces meant to guide devotion. Later generations restored the mosaics, layering belief on top of belief. The building became a palimpsest, faith written, erased, and written again. The most traumatic blow came not from within but from outside. In the early 13th century, foreign armies breached Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. Hagia Sophia was looted, sacred vessels were stolen, altars were desecrated. For the first time, the cathedral served a different Christian authority, its rituals altered by conquerors who claimed to share the same faith. Yet even this occupation was temporary. When Byzantine rule returned, Hagia Sophia returned with it, wounded but standing. Each survival reinforced the idea that the building was protected, if not by God, then by history itself. By the time the medieval era drew toward its end, Hagia Sophia had already lived several lives. It had been damaged, violated, repaired, and reimagined. What remained constant was its presence. Empires trembled around it, but the dome still rose above the city, waiting, not knowing that its greatest transformation was still to come. In the spring of 1453, Constantinople fell. After weeks of siege, the walls were breached, and the ancient capital of Byzantium passed into new hands. When Mehmed II entered the city, he did not ride first to a palace or treasury. He went directly to Hagia Sophia, the symbolic heart of the fallen empire. Inside the cathedral, chaos reigned. Civilians had taken refuge beneath the dome, believing the building's sanctity might protect them. Prayers echoed against marble, as the sounds of conquest closed in. This was not the quiet transformation later imagined by historians. It was a moment of fear, confusion, and collapse. An empire that had defined itself through this space was ending here. Mehmed ordered the violence to stop within the building. According to accounts, he was struck not by triumph, but by scale. The structure was intact. The dome still hovered. The city had fallen, but its greatest monument remained. Almost immediately, Mehmed claimed the building, not to destroy it, but to transform it. Hagia Sophia would become a mosque. The change was swift but deliberate. A prayer niche was installed. A pulpit added. Christian liturgical objects were removed or covered. Mosaics were plastered over, not smashed. The structure itself was respected, even preserved. For the Ottomans, conversion was not an act of erasure alone, but of inheritance. The building's power was too great to abandon. It needed to be absorbed. The first Islamic prayer was held under the dome that had once carried Byzantine chant. Arabic replaced Greek. Prostration replaced procession. The direction of devotion shifted, but the sense of awe did not. The space still dwarfed the human body. It still suggested something vast and eternal overhead. This moment redefined Hagia Sophia's meaning. It was no longer exclusively Christian, nor merely Byzantine. It became imperial again, this time for a rising Ottoman world. The building did not resist. It adapted as it always had. For many, this transformation symbolized loss. For others, fulfillment. For the structure itself, it was survival through change. Hagia Sophia did not belong to one empire anymore. It belonged to history's momentum, shaped not by belief alone, but by those powerful enough to redefine sacred space without tearing it down. Under Ottoman rule, the dome remained, and beneath it, a new chapter of whispered prayers began. Once Hagia Sophia became a mosque, its transformation unfolded gradually rather than violently. The Ottomans did not rush to remake the building in their own image. Instead, they listened to it. They observed how it stood, how it aged, and how it responded to time. What followed was not replacement, but accommodation. Minarets were added one by one over generations, rising like punctuation marks around the ancient dome. They did not compete with it, they framed it. Each addition marked a period of confidence and continuity, signaling that the building now served a new faith without surrendering its past. From these towers, the call to prayer drifted across the city, layering new sound over old stone. Inside, the space grew quieter. Christian mosaics were covered but not destroyed. Faces vanished beneath plaster, yet their presence lingered invisibly, sealed rather than erased. This silence was intentional. The Ottomans understood the power of restraint. By leaving the structure intact, they claimed not just a building, but the authority of history itself. Ottoman architects studied Hagia Sophia carefully. They measured it, sketched it, and learned from it. Its daring dome became a reference point for generations of mosques that followed. In this way, Hagia Sophia shaped Islamic architecture, just as it had once shaped Christian worship. The building became a teacher, transmitting knowledge across belief systems without speaking a word. Daily life returned beneath the dome. Worshippers prayed on carpets laid over ancient marble. Footsteps softened. Light filtered differently as lamps replaced candles. The building adjusted to new rhythms, new gestures, new expectations, yet the sense of scale remained unchanged. The human body still felt small beneath the vast curve overhead. Earthquakes continued. Repairs followed. Buttresses were strengthened. Cracks were sealed. Each intervention preserved the structure while acknowledging its vulnerability. The Ottomans did not treat Hagia Sophia as untouchable. They treated it as alive, something that required care, attention, and adaptation. Over time, the building ceased to feel foreign to its new role. Generations were born, lived and died knowing Hagia Sophia only as a mosque. Its Christian past faded into abstraction, remembered by scholars more than by worshippers. What mattered was that the building endured, not frozen but evolving. In this long Ottoman chapter, Hagia Sophia became a lesson in continuity. Sacred space, it revealed, does not vanish when belief changes. It absorbs. It carries memory quietly. And sometimes, survival itself becomes the most sacred act of all. By the early 20th century, the world surrounding Hagia Sophia had changed beyond recognition. The Ottoman Empire collapsed after centuries of rule, and a new republic emerged from its ruins. In this moment of reinvention, the building once again found itself at the center of a radical decision, not born of conquest but of ideology. Under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the new Turkish Republic sought to define itself as secular, modern, and forward-looking. Religion was no longer to dominate public identity. Symbols mattered, and Hagia Sophia, layered with centuries of Christian and Islamic authority, stood as the most powerful symbol of all. In the 1930s, the decision was made to transform the mosque into a museum. This was unprecedented. Rather than choosing one faith over another, the state chose neutrality, or at least the appearance of it. Worship ceased, carpets were removed. Restoration teams began carefully uncovering the mosaics that had been hidden for centuries beneath plaster and paint. For the first time, Christian imagery and Islamic architecture coexisted openly in the same space. Golden saints re-emerged above Arabic calligraphy. Faces long concealed returned to the light, not as objects of devotion but as historical artifacts. Hagia Sophia was reframed as heritage rather than sanctuary. This transformation changed how the building was experienced. Silence replaced prayer. Visitors moved slowly, looking upward rather than inward. The dome no longer gathered voices, it gathered attention. Hagia Sophia became a place to observe history rather than participate in it. To some, this was liberation. To others, loss. The building was preserved, studied, and admired by millions, but it was no longer spiritually alive in the way it once had been. Sacred time gave way to museum hours. Reverence became curiosity, yet this chapter ensured survival. As a museum, Hagia Sophia was protected by international agreements and global attention. Its mosaics were conserved, its structure monitored, its story told to the world in a new language, one of art, architecture, and shared human history. In stepping away from worship, Hagia Sophia gained a different kind of immortality. It became a space where centuries stood side by side without hierarchy, where empires were flattened into chronology. For a moment in its long life, the building belonged not to God or state, but to memory itself, and as always, it waited, because history had never finished with it. In the early 21st century, Hagia Sophia once again became the focus of a national reckoning. For decades it had stood as a museum, silent, admired, carefully neutral, but neutrality, especially when imposed by the state, rarely lasts forever. As Turkey's political and cultural identity shifted, so did the meaning attached to the building. In 2020, the Turkish government announced that Hagia Sophia would be reconverted into a mosque. The decision was framed not as destruction or rejection of history, but as restoration. Supporters argued that the building had been taken out of religious use unnaturally, that returning prayer restored continuity rather than breaking it. To them, Hagia Sophia had waited long enough. Opponents saw something else. They worried that the building's fragile balance, Christian mosaics, Islamic calligraphy, secular access would be disrupted. International voices expressed concern over preservation, symbolism, and exclusion. Once again, Hagia Sophia was no longer just a building, it was a statement. Prayer resumed beneath the dome. Carpets returned. The call to prayer echoed again from the minarets. At the same time, mosaics remained protected, veiled during worship and revealed outside prayer hours. The structure adapted yet again, carrying old compromises into a new era. What changed most was the atmosphere. The building was no longer silent, it breathed again. Worshippers filled the space not as tourists but as participants in ritual. For some, this restored meaning that a museum could never provide. For others, it marked the loss of a rare shared space that belonged equally to all. As it had for centuries, Hagia Sophia absorbed the tension without collapsing. The dome still rose. Light still filtered through its windows. The walls still carried the memory of chants and prayers layered across time. The debate surrounding the building revealed something deeper than politics. It exposed how strongly humans attach identity to stone and space. Hagia Sophia has never been neutral. It has always reflected whoever held power: emperors, sultans, republics, governments, each projecting meaning onto its vast interior. And yet, none of them truly owned it. The building has outlasted every decision made about it. It has been claimed, renamed, repurposed and reinterpreted, and still remains. In returning to worship, Hagia Sophia did not erase its past. It added another layer, just as it always has. What makes Hagia Sophia unlike almost any other structure on Earth is not simply its age or beauty, but its memory. The building remembers everything, not consciously of course, but materially. Every crack, repair, covering and restoration is a physical record of belief, fear, ambition, and compromise layered over one another for nearly 15 centuries. Stand beneath the dome and you are surrounded by traces of vanished worlds. Byzantine worshippers once stood where visitors now walk. Ottoman calligraphers once measured these walls carefully, choosing words large enough to converse with eternity. Secular restorers peeled back plaster, not to pray, but to document. Each group believed they were defining the building's meaning. None of them erased the others completely. Hagia Sophia resists purity. It cannot be reduced to a single identity without lying. Its Christian mosaics still exist, even when covered. Its Islamic features remain central, even when worship pauses. Its time as a museum reshaped how the world understood it. Even after that chapter ended, the building carries contradiction without collapsing under it. This is why the structure provokes such strong emotion. People do not argue about architecture alone. They argue about what should be remembered, what should be hidden, and who has the authority to decide. Hagia Sophia makes those questions unavoidable. It forces faith, politics and history into the same space, and refuses to let any of them dominate completely for long. The building has also shaped how later generations imagined sacred architecture. Its dome influenced mosques far beyond Istanbul. Its spatial drama influenced churches long after Byzantium fell. Even modern architects study its balance of mass and light, still unsure how something so daring continues to stand. Hagia Sophia has survived earthquakes, invasions, ideological revolutions, and global scrutiny, not because it is fragile, but because it adapts. It bends without surrendering. It absorbs meaning without being exhausted by it. Perhaps this is its quiet lesson. Sacred spaces are not frozen truths. They are living negotiations between human belief and time. Hagia Sophia does not choose sides, it endures them. Every whispered prayer, every footstep, every argument about its future becomes part of its story. And long after current debates fade, the building will still be there. Not taking a position, but remembering that humans always needed places big enough to hold their contradictions. In that sense, Hagia Sophia is less a monument than a witness. Beneath the great dome of Hagia Sophia, time does not feel linear, it gathers. Centuries overlap in the same way light overlaps shadow across the marble floor. A visitor standing still can sense it, not as history lesson or political symbol, but as weight. The building presses gently downward, reminding everyone beneath it that they are temporary, and it is not. What makes Hagia Sophia endure is not agreement about what it should be. It has never enjoyed consensus for long. What it has always had is relevance. Each age looks at the building and sees its own questions reflected back. Empire asked how power could be made sacred. Faith asked how heaven could touch earth. Modernity asked whether belief could be set aside for preservation. The present asks whether history can ever truly be neutral. The structure does not answer. It holds. Prayers still rise beneath the dome as they once did in different languages and postures. Tourists still look upward in silence, even when they do not know why. Architects still study its impossible balance. Believers still feel something difficult to explain. Skeptics still feel it too. Hagia Sophia does not require belief to produce awe. This is why it has survived where so many symbols have failed. It does not insist on a single story. It accepts being reinterpreted without becoming meaningless. It allows each generation to inscribe itself lightly, knowing that time will eventually layer something else on top. Empires believed they had claimed it forever. They did not. Governments believed they had defined it permanently. They did not. Even faiths that filled it with certainty eventually yielded to change. Hagia Sophia outlasted them all. Not by resisting history, but by letting history pass through it. Perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath the controversy. The building does not belong to the past, nor fully to the present. It belongs to duration, to the long view that humans rarely afford themselves. Long after current arguments fade, after today's decisions are revised or forgotten, the dome will still rise above the city. Light will still enter through its windows, stone will still bear the marks of hands long gone, and beneath it people will continue to gather, to pray, to wonder, to argue, to remember, because Hagia Sophia was never just a place of worship or a monument of stone. It was and remains a structure built to hold time itself.